So you guys know that Venezuela and Argentina have just taught Washington, D.C. an incredibly important lesson, right? These are two very different countries, but 20 years ago, they found themselves in a very similar position, both turning very strongly to the left. Washington, D.C. reacted to Venezuela's leftists with maximum pressure, threats, sanctions, and even an attempted coup or two. With Argentina, we just sort of sat back and ignored them. The results are clear. 20 years of strenuous effort and humiliation later, Washington, D.C. is still negotiating with a socialist dictator in Venezuela. After we let Argentina make its own choices for 20 years, they have just elected a new president who is so pro-United States, it's almost scary. This provides a really basic lesson of U.S. empire. When we let countries make their own choices, they tend to eventually do what we want. Any comparison of Venezuela and Argentina has to acknowledge that they are two very different places. Most importantly, Argentina is much further away from the United States. This is true both geographically and economically. Argentina's primary exports are agricultural, and they go all over the world. Venezuela is all about petroleum, and the United States has traditionally been the main market for Venezuelan oil. So the biggest geopolitical event of the post-World War II era hit these two countries very differently. The 1973 oil crisis worked out all right for petroleum exporting Venezuela, and it worked out nightmarishly badly for Argentina. Argentina is a country that has never recovered from the first era of globalization. They really had it figured out under the British world system that ended with World War I. From the mid-1800s to the 1910s, Argentina went from a backwater with under 1 million people to being one of Europe's biggest breadbaskets. Argentina became one of the richest countries on the planet. Millions of European migrants and free-ish trade under British hegemony gave Argentina a golden age of prosperity and orderly government that lasted from 1870 or so all the way up until the Great Depression in 1930. Things have been a mess more or less ever since. The world economy has continued to have peaks and valleys, but it has never needed Argentina's agricultural products as badly as it did before the world wars. Argentina's 20th century history, and arguably the first decades of the 21st, have been dominated by one political figure, Juan Perón, and the idiosyncratic political machine that he created in the 1940s and 1950s. Peronism seemed to work for a few decades there, distributing the diminishing returns of Argentina's agricultural bounty fairly well. Argentina continued to fall behind, but inflation and budget deficits were more or less held in check. Then came the 1973 oil crisis, a disaster that hit a lot of the world almost as hard, if not harder than, the Great Depression. For just shy of 3 decades after World War II, oil prices were low and stable. This meant that worldwide, inflation was manageable and prices tended to stay low and stable. Exchange rates were also generally fixed in that era, and while interest rates were not low by today's standards, they were predictable, which meant that many countries felt safe taking on large levels of debt. All of this was broken by the 1973 oil crisis. All countries had become reliant on cheap oil that was now at least 4 times more expensive. This created massive inflation everywhere, which of course hit less economically diversified countries like Argentina harder. The large piles of debt most countries had accumulated under the easier financial conditions of the 1950s and 1960s were now much more expensive to refinance. In the crisis context, foreign money became more important for economic stability, just as it became much more expensive and more difficult to get. Argentina spiraled into chaos and then horror over the course of the 1970s. Juan Perón himself came back to power, then promptly died. His wife governed for a few years thereafter. She failed to solve anything and gave more and more power to a viciously violent military until the soldiers eventually took over entirely. The only solution the military dictatorship had was mass murder. A dirty war that killed as many as 30,000 Argentinians between 1974 and 1983. It's worth emphasizing how nasty this period of Argentine history was and how heavily the United States supported it. The military dictatorship was killing communists, and we really liked that. There is a very deep, very justified vein of anti-United States resentment in Argentinian politics, which makes it all the more shocking that they have just elected such a massively pro-U.S. president. Meanwhile, Venezuela was one of the world's few developing countries that benefited from 1973. Enemies of Hugo Chavez overemphasized the peace and prosperity of Venezuela before 1998, but by Venezuelan standards, it was pretty impressive. From independence under Simón Bolívar down to the late 1950s, Venezuela had never strung together more than a few years of stable, non-dictatorial government. In 1958, three of the country's political parties made a pact to work towards democratic consolidation. And thanks in large part to skyrocketing oil revenues, the pact held for 4 decades. Again, we shouldn't romanticize Venezuela's 1958 to 1998 period. A super corrupt oligarchy did manage to change power in more democratically, officially looking ways, but poverty persisted, in some ways got worse, income inequality skyrocketed, and there were a series of guerrilla insurgencies and financial disasters. But by the standards of Venezuelan history, it does look pretty good. Argentina's military had failed to solve any of Argentina's economic problems. Their policy of mass murder was also not popular. So they tried to solve their issues by starting a war with the United Kingdom over the Falkland Islands. In what is probably her greatest contribution to humanity, Margaret Thatcher beat Argentina's dictatorship soundly, prompting its fall from power. Raúl Alfonsín, a left-leaning politician, was elected president in 1983. Over 6 years in power, he helped Argentine politics and society recover from the horrors of the military junta. Unfortunately, he too failed to solve any of Argentina's steadily mounting economic problems. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States, the world hegemon, finally got its act together and figured out how to respond to the oil crisis. It decided to solve inflation by massively jacking up interest rates. Most agree that this did work, but in the process it made things much more difficult for countries like Argentina that now had to pay even more money to roll over its debts. And post-oil crisis, U.S. policy managed to hurt Venezuela as well. The developed world's massive drive for fuel efficiency and a developed new fossil fuel sources like the North Sea managed to crash oil prices in the 1980s. Those prices wouldn't fully recover until the China shock in the first decade of this century. Venezuela and Mexico are both big oil producers, so they had a pretty good time in the 1970s while all of their neighbors suffered. Unfortunately, Venezuela and Mexico also assumed that the high oil prices would last forever, so they took on a ton of debt in the 1970s that proved to be very unsustainable in the next decade. The 1980s are seen as a lost economic decade for pretty much everyone in Latin America, thanks to debt crises brought on by interest rates set by the United States. Venezuela began to fall into the same sorts of spiraling debt and financial crises that faced Argentina. Oil revenue kept things from being as severe, but in some ways this was worse in Venezuela. The country had never really been as broadly prosperous as Argentina had once been. Venezuelans knew their country had lucked out during the 1970s, but hadn't seen many benefits before being placed on the same austerity merry-go-round that the non-petrostate developing world had to deal with. This led to a great deal of resentment of Venezuelan elites, exemplified by the 1989 Carrasco riots, which saw Venezuelan security forces kill hundreds, possibly thousands of their own citizens. Strangely, 20 years after very different 1970s experiences, Argentina and Venezuela found themselves in similar circumstances in the 1990s. The United States had just won the Cold War. History was over, communism had been defeated, and the world was out of alternatives. So both countries opted for go-go U.S. capitalism in the 1990s. Argentina's Carlos Menem was a Peronist, but he was also one of Latin America's most prominent standard-bearers for the Washington Consensus. He was all about privatization, a currency pegged to the dollar, neoliberalism, and rolling out the red carpet for big business. In Venezuela, the ancient Rafael Caldera was trotted out to attempt to make similar Washington Consensus policies palatable to a Venezuelan political scene that was already seeing renewed coup attempts. Both men failed pretty miserably. Menem's financial management in Argentina led to unsustainable debt levels and default in 2001. Caldera failed to deal with inflation, low oil prices, and a related banking crisis, but he did at least manage to keep the country together enough to lose power democratically. You can't understand the two countries' turn towards anti-U.S. leftism in the 2000s without understanding how pro-U.S. their policies were in the 1990s. Both countries were led by men who promised to save their countries through business magic and by cozying up to the hegemon. Both men failed pretty spectacularly. Venezuela turned left first. By 1998, oil prices were in the toilet after failing to impress for most of 2 decades. According to the New York Times, 80% of Venezuelans were living in poverty and 40% were malnourished. In a situation like that, it's not particularly surprising that Hugo Chavez was able to win the December 1998 election with a promise to overturn the quasi-democratic oligarchy that had stolen Venezuela's oil bounty. Chavez's victory in Venezuela was a revolution at the ballot box, but it was calm and orderly compared to what happened in Argentina. The pro-business policies of the Menem government led to complete disaster. U.S. and IMF recommendations led to an economic period so bad it's known as the Argentine Great Depression of 1998 through 2002. December 2001 saw food riots in Argentine cities, limits on the amount of money individuals could take out of their bank accounts, and a full-on debt default. December and January 2001 saw Argentina cycle through 5 presidents, mostly selected by the legislature. Argentina finally began to emerge from the crisis with a massive devaluation of the currency. In 2003, Carlos Menem, the architect of the disaster, ran for the presidency again, but pulled out when it was clear he would lose. Nestor Kirchner, confusingly representing a different wing of the same Peronist party, won the election and took the country in a stridently left-wing direction. Kirchner and then his wife held power for the next 12 years. Again, it's worth considering how many more reasons Argentina has to be angry at the United States than Venezuela does. The U.S.-sponsored military dictatorship in the 1970s murdered thousands. Argentina's adherence to U.S.-favored economic policies in the 1990s led to complete catastrophe. Venezuela, by contrast, mostly knew the United States as the place where the oil money came from. The Venezuelan public rightly blamed local politicians for mismanagement more than they blamed U.S. policies. At the beginning in 1998, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez's Bolivarian revolution was much more about attacking local corruption than the United States. It was U.S. aggression that would change the focus of Venezuelan revolutionary politics and give it the fuel it needed to survive for a full quarter century. As a grim side note, there are many reasons why Venezuelan leftism pissed the U.S. off more than the Argentinian version. But it's hard to shake the suspicion that after the Cold War, Argentina's politicians were just safer because it's a whiter country. Washington, D.C. might be more comfortable plotting coups against indigenous-looking presidents than Swiss-looking presidents. Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, quickly put a new constitution in place, and was re-elected under the new rules in 2000. In April 2002, he was briefly ousted in a coup that pushed him in a much more stridently anti-U.S. direction. Now, I don't want to go full Chavista and claim that the Bush administration planned and carried out this 2002 coup. It's still a controversial question. There were plenty of elements in Venezuela, like the state oil company and elements of the military, that wanted him gone. But Chavez still has a right to be pretty angry at the United States over this 2002 coup. It's undisputed that the U.S. had full knowledge that the coup was about to happen. After the coup's failure, Washington, D.C. claimed they warned Chavez and tried to discourage the multiple Venezuelan forces that let us know the coup was going to happen. These claims are hard to believe when you consider how fully the Bush administration embraced the 2-day anti-Chavez government. We recognize the fake 48-hour president and pretty openly gloated about the fall of Chavez. When the coup quickly disintegrated, U.S.-Venezuelan relations were in the toilet, and they have been there ever since. Between 2002 and 2008, thanks primarily to Chinese growth, world oil prices had their best stretch since the 1970s, more than tripling in dollar value. This gave Chavez endless opportunities to express his displeasure over U.S. support for the failed coup. The main lesson of this video is that if the United States wants more friendly governments, it should be less aggressive. But we do have to acknowledge that Chavez and especially Maduro's policies have been pretty stupid. Even in the period when oil prices were spectacularly high in the first decade of this century, the United States was still buying the vast majority of Venezuela's oil. It's never a good idea to bite the hand that feeds you. Argentina in the 2000s was also angry at the United States, but in very different ways. Interminable battles with New York bankers over defaulted debt, plus lengthy negotiations with U.S.-controlled institutions like the IMF, kept relations sour for years. But there were no coup attempts, no economy-killing sanctions. There were no threats of invasion or other forms of violence. So eventually, Argentina just got sick of the Kirchners. And that wasn't just a few months ago. It was almost a full decade ago. In 2015, after spending 15 years negotiating with international bankers, Argentina went ahead and elected an international banker. Mauricio Macri was an Argentinian rich kid who had been educated in the United States and done a stint with Citibank before going to work with his family real estate company. His center-right pro-business politics were trusted abroad, and Argentina was allowed to borrow large amounts of international money for the first time since 2001. So as early as 2015, Argentina and Venezuela already provided a pretty good lesson on how to deal with hostile governments. Support a coup and make constant threats, and you're likely to just make the government you don't like even stronger. But if you step back and let the government succeed or fail on its own merits, the chances are pretty good you'll end up with a government you like better before too long. Hugo Chavez died of cancer in 2013 and was replaced by Nicolas Maduro, a politician with none of Chavez's virtues and all of his flaws. Maduro is a terrible president, but the United States has been kind enough to provide him with the perfect enemy, which has kept him in power. The Kirchners, who did actually manage to stabilize Argentina after 2001, couldn't blame a big U.S. imperial enemy as plausibly as Maduro could, so they were out of power by 2015. Unfortunately for Argentina, the Macri government wasn't any better at solving the country's problems than the Kirchners were. In fact, he may have been even worse. Much of Argentina's current debt crisis stems from Macri's borrowing a bunch of foreign money to do a tax cut. Timid Reaganism has already been tried and has already failed in Argentina. In 2019, Macri lost an election to Alberto Fernandez, a close ally of the Kirchner wing of Peronism. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is kind of a mystery. He is largely seen as a thug who lacks Chavez's flair for publicity, public speaking skills, and creativity. Maduro certainly lacks Chavez's petroleum luck. He took power in 2013, just in time for world oil prices to crash in 2014. Despite small spikes over the past decade, those oil prices have never really recovered. Venezuela has a vibrant, if chaotic, opposition scene both abroad and within Venezuela. Yet despite all of this, a full decade later, Maduro is still in power. How? Well, I think the answer is Donald Trump and the ludicrous policy of maximum U.S. pressure that he inaugurated. Biden, to his shame, has mostly continued this same policy. In 2017, things were already falling apart in Venezuela. Maduro looked very shaky. But then Trump stepped in and gave him the perfect enemy. In August of 2017, the Trump administration introduced sweeping sanctions, blocking the Venezuelan government and the state oil company from most interactions with the U.S. financial industry. Because the United States has always been Venezuela's main customer and owns most of the refineries that can handle Venezuelan oil, this quickly led to starvation and a massive refugee crisis. I have to tell on myself a bit here, sort of do a bit of a correction. In earlier coverage of the 2019 Venezuela crisis, I fell for the U.S. media lie that it was mostly about socialist mismanagement. Don't get me wrong, Chavez and Maduro are really bad at government, but we would not have seen the massive refugee crisis, the large-scale malnutrition, and even starvation that we saw in 2019 without the 2017 Trump sanctions. Very few people in the United States are aware of this. everybody in Venezuela is. So U.S. aggression took a thuggish and failed leader and turned him into a hero against U.S. imperialism. In 2019, surprised that their starvation program hadn't worked, the Trump administration's approach got even more ridiculous. From January 2019, we worked with the Venezuelan opposition to just pretend that Maduro was no longer the president of Venezuela. That's right, we just decided that some other guy, Juan Guaido, was now the president of Venezuela. And we bullied like 60 of our allies into recognizing him as well. We just decided to pretend, fake it till you make it, manifest it, like The Secret or something. It did not work. Nobody talks about this anymore, and for good reason. It's one of the most humiliating episodes in U.S. imperial history. The Trumpers anointed Guaido at the same time as they inaugurated a raft of new murderous sanctions against Venezuela's oil industry, essentially barring any other country in the world from buying oil from Venezuela. Unsurprisingly to anyone other than official foreign policy morons like John Bolton and Elliott Abrams, there was no Venezuelan uprising in favor of the U.S.-sponsored starvation and poverty president. Trump and company turned Maduro into an anti-imperial hero, so the U.S. still has to negotiate with him down to today. The script was already long enough, so I won't go into Maduro's ridiculous threats to invade and take over large parts of Guyana, Venezuela's neighbor. If you're interested in a full hour of history and predictions on the Venezuela-Guyana Essequibo situation, you can check out our recent podcast episode. Meanwhile, Mauricio Macri, the pro-U.S. president who, unlike Juan Guaido, was actually elected, failed to solve any of Argentina's problems. He was voted out in favor of the Fernandez-Kirchner left-wing bloc that had once been so closely allied with Chavez's Venezuela. So what did the U.S. do about this in 2019? Did we sanction Argentina's new left-wing government? Did we try to starve its public? Did we threaten invasion or just pretend that Macri was still the real president? No, we didn't do any of that. We did absolutely nothing, and it succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Between 2015 and 19, Argentina tried wimpy Reaganism, and it failed. The Argentine public gave the leftists another 4 years in power, and they didn't fix anything either. The United States didn't give those leftists a convenient enemy to blame, so in 2023, those leftists got kicked out of power. And the new guy is so pro-United States, it's honestly a little insane. They've gone from timid Reaganism to chainsaw Reaganism. Javier Milei is likely to fail as president. But it's honestly amazing to see Argentina even entertain this radical pro-U.S. agenda a mere 40 years after kicking out a savagely murderous pro-U.S. dictatorship. If the U.S. wants more friendly governments in Latin America, or anywhere, we just need to stop attacking governments. Most of Latin America now rotates between left and right-leaning governments through the ballot box, which strikes me as pretty damn healthy. The goal, actually. There are three big exceptions where left-wing authoritarians still retain serious power. These three countries are Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. At this point, it probably shouldn't surprise you to hear that these three countries are the exact same three countries that have been subjected to the most vicious U.S. pressure over the past half-century. The more aggressive we are towards a particular government, the more excuses that government has to hang on to power. If we really wanted a universally free and prosperous hemisphere, we would change course. We would tell Venezuela and Cuba and everybody else that they can do whatever they want, though, of course, there's a bigger pot of gold available to those who adopt policies that we like. This is a cheap and easy strategy that has only worked every single time we've tried it, in every place that we've tried it. But I don't think Washington, D.C. really wants the Americas to be universally prosperous and free. I suspect that they might want to maintain some enemies to sell weapons around.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.